Imagine for a moment that you are trapped in just a complete nightmare of heat, dust, and unimaginable noise.
Yeah.
You've somehow survived 2 days pinned down on a sun-baked bluff by, well, the most formidable indigenous coalition ever assembled on the plains, and you're severely wounded.
Right. We're talking catastrophic injuries.
Exactly. Maybe a shattered femur from a heavy caliber rifle ball or a deep, festering arrow wound. The battle is finally over. The valley is this smoking ruin. And now the surviving officers come over and tell you that salvation is a steamboat.
Which sounds great until you hear the catch.
Right. The catch is that the steamboat is 15 miles away.
Yeah.
Across completely broken, hostile wilderness. And to get there, you have to be strapped to a makeshift litter and dragged by a mule.
It's a scenario that completely defies our modern comprehension.
Totally.
Today, if we look at military medical extraction, we expect this highly structured, almost frictionless system.
Yeah, a medevac chopper gets called in.
Exactly. GPS coordinates are locked. A trauma team is waiting on the tarmac. The whole system is engineered to conquer the elements and just minimize time.
Right.
But in the late June heat of 1876, right in the immediate aftermath of the Battle of the Little Bighorn, that precision machinery simply did not exist.
Not even a little bit.
No. You are looking at a logistical and diagnostic landscape defined entirely by isolation, sheer desperation, and extreme physical agony.
Well, welcome to the deep dive. I am thrilled you're here for this special presentation from the Crazy Horse Chronicles research staff.
It's a heavy one today.
It really is. Because have you ever considered what actually happens the minute a battle ends in total disaster? Like, how do you extract shattered survivors from a completely roadless frontier?
It's a logistical nightmare.
And on top of that, how does the news of this unimaginable defeat travel from a remote wilderness all the way to a nation that is currently throwing itself a massive birthday party?
The Centennial.
Right. So that is our mission today. We are exploring downriver to Bismarck, the message that changed everything. And we're focusing specifically on that astonishing window from June 28th to July 5th, 1876.
And before we get into the hour-by-hour timeline, it's really vital to lay out the house style for you, the listener.
Always important.
Yeah, because as part of the Crazy Horse Chronicles mission, we take an artifacts over orthodoxy approach here.
Which means?
Which means we will be looking at the raw, logistical, medical, and human realities of this moment. We acknowledge the differing accounts in the historical record.
Like the exact casualty counts, right?
Exactly. For instance, the exact count of the wounded varies across the ledgers, and we explore these events without any false certainty. Our goal is to synthesize the ground truth as best as the primary sources allow and leave the myth-making at the door.
Artifacts over orthodoxy. I love it. So let's set the stage here. It's late June 1876.
The dust is literally settling.
Right. The Battle of the Little Bighorn has just concluded, and it is an unmitigated disaster for the 7th Cavalry. General George Armstrong Custer and his immediate command of 212 men have been wiped out. To the last man.
The entire immediate detachment. Gone.
And then you have Major Marcus Reno's besieged troops. They had been pinned down on the bluffs above the river. They survived, but at a just horrific cost.
Yeah, the casualty numbers for Reno's men are staggering.
Over 50 killed.
Over 50 killed. And they are nursing somewhere between 51 to 54 desperately wounded men.
So General Alfred Terry and Colonel John Gibbon, they arrive with their relief columns on the 27th and 28th to relieve Reno. And what they find is an absolute charnel house.
It's diagnostic muddy waters compounded by sheer geographical isolation. General Terry arrives expecting to coordinate this grand military campaign and instantly realizes, oh, I am commanding a mass casualty medical crisis.
It's a completely different job.
Entirely. And what's fascinating here is the sheer burden placed on the surviving medical personnel. I mean, the 7th Cavalry originally marched out with 3 medical officers.
Oh.
One of them, Dr. George Lord, was with Custer's column. He was killed.
Wow.
Another, Dr. James DeWolf, was killed during Major Reno's chaotic retreat from the valley up to the bluffs.
Which leaves exactly one doctor standing for the entire surviving regiment.
Yes.
Assistant Surgeon Henry R. Porter.
Dr. Porter is a 28-year-old physician.
28.
I know. He suddenly finds himself as the sole medical authority for dozens of men suffering from the most catastrophic trauma imaginable.
And this is 1876 field medicine.
Right. We have to remember the era. Joseph Lister's theories on antiseptic surgery are known, but they haven't been universally adopted or perfected in field medicine.
Especially not in a dusty encampment in the middle of Montana.
Yeah. Exactly. Porter is dealing with compound fractures, spinal injuries, severe blood loss, and the immediate, terrifying onset of infection. And he's armed with little more than rudimentary bandages, chloroform, and his pocket surgical instruments.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second. Because Porter has somehow kept these men alive through the siege, which is honestly a miracle in itself.
A medical miracle.
But now, Terry tells them they have to move. They can't stay in this valley. I mean, the Native Coalition, the Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, Arapaho, they've withdrawn, sure.
But the psychological terror is absolutely still hanging over the surviving troops.
They're terrified. A counterattack could happen at any moment.
Yeah.
So Terry's immediate logistical hurdle is moving over 50 incapacitated men 15 miles down the Little Bighorn Valley.
Right, to its confluence with the Bighorn River.
Right, because waiting at the mouth of the Bighorn River is the steamboat Far West, which Terry had ordered to act as a sort of floating supply depot.
So Salvation is sitting there 15 miles away.
But 15 miles. I mean, moving a man with a shattered pelvis 15 miles over uneven brush-choked terrain. That might as well be a journey to the moon.
It really might as well be. And the primary sources detail the agony of that first attempt to move them.
Yeah, I was looking at the logistics of this march, and the initial attempts on June 28th were just disastrous. Gibbon's troops try to help, and they construct these improvised hand litters.
Just blankets and poles, basically.
Right. Stretchers made of blankets and poles carried by 4 soldiers, but mathematically and biomechanically, hand-carrying a heavy adult over broken ground for miles.
You can't sustain it.
You just can't. The soldiers carrying the litters are exhausted, they're stumbling into ravines, they're tripping over sagebrush, and with every single stumble, the wounded men are being violently jolted.
The accounts are brutal to read. The wounded were literally pleading with the carriers to put them down.
Oh.
They were saying they preferred to take their chances on the ground, maybe be left behind, rather than endure the excruciating pain of being dropped or jostled anymore. The hand litters were so inefficient and caused so much suffering that Terry's column barely made any progress.
They just had to stop.
They had to halt completely.
And this forces a massive pivot. By the next day, June 29th, the military adapts. They realize human draft power isn't going to work, so they shift to animal draft power.
Which is where the mules come in.
Yes, they start building mule litters. And looking at the construction of these litters, it's clear they were essentially adopting a variation of the travois, utilizing materials they actually left behind in the massive abandoned Native American village.
That is such a crucial detail. The Army actually scavenged lodge poles from the abandoned Lakota and Cheyenne encampments.
Because they had no other wood.
Right.
Right.
And the travois, of course, is a traditional Native American transport device. It's 2 long poles trailing behind a horse or a dog with a web frame in the middle to carry loads.
So they just steal that engineering concept.
They do. The Army engineers took this concept and modified it into a tandem mule litter. They would take 2 mules, put them single file, and sling the long lodge poles between them.
So 1 mule in front, 1 in back.
Exactly. And they suspended a canvas or blanket bed in the middle of those poles.
It's a brilliant adaptation on the fly, but I still have to imagine it wasn't a smooth ride. I mean, mules aren't exactly known for their synchronized marching.
No, they certainly aren't. And that was the major flaw. If the front mule stepped down into a rut while the back mule stepped up over a rock, the entire litter would twist violently.
Oh, man. Just wringing those guys out.
Yes. To mitigate this, the soldiers had to meticulously select the calmest mules. And then men had to walk alongside each animal to steady the poles and literally try to keep the mules walking in phase.
That sounds exhausting.
It was a painstaking, highly labor-intensive process. They moved at an agonizingly slow pace. We're talking maybe a mile or 2 an hour under a blazing sun.
You could just feel the exhaustion of that column. Just dust choking the air, the constant low groans of the wounded, the smell of blood and sweat. Dr. Porter is moving endlessly up and down the line, right?
Checking tourniquets, distributing whatever meager rations of water they had left.
And every ridge they crossed, the scouts were scanning the horizon, expecting thousands of warriors to suddenly reappear. It wasn't just a physical march, it was a total psychological crucible.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, it really highlights a fundamental truth about frontier warfare. The battle itself is only a fraction of the ordeal.
Right.
The real killer, the real terror, was the environment itself once the shooting stopped. Surviving the combat was merely the first filter.
Which finally brings us to the riverbank. After this grueling crawl, the deafening silence of the valley gives way to the sound of rushing water. and the sight of a vessel that must have looked like an absolute mirage to these men.
It really must have. At the confluence of the Little Bighorn and the Bighorn rivers sits the far west.
Our steamboat.
Our steamboat. This vessel had been chartered by the government specifically for the 1876 campaign. Its job was to transport supplies, ferry troops, and act as a mobile headquarters.
And commanding it was Captain Grant Marsh.
Captain Grant Marsh.
We have to talk about him, because the historical accounts universally refer to him as the king of the pilots on the upper Missouri.
He was a legend.
This wasn't some rookie assigned to a backwater detail. Marsh was the absolute elite. He was the guy the government trusted to haul millions of dollars in gold out of the Montana mines.
Marsh understood the rivers of the American West better than almost anyone alive. So on the morning of June 30th, the battered column finally reaches the riverbank.
Oh, God.
Captain Marsh has been waiting. He receives the wounded. But he doesn't just load them onto the deck like cargo. He makes this fascinating and honestly deeply humane logistical decision.
I love this detail so much. To accommodate the 51 to 54 wounded men, and again, accounts very slightly on the exact final number, brought aboard, Marsh orders his crew to go ashore and harvest massive amounts of freshly cut river grass.
Just mountains of it.
Yeah. They spread this thick layer of green grass all across the deck, cover it with canvas tarpaulins, and lay the men on top.
It acts as an organic shock absorber.
Right.
He knew the journey ahead was going to be violently turbulent, and laying men with shattered bones directly onto the hard oak planks of a vibrating steamboat deck would have been fatal.
It would have killed them before they got to a doctor.
Absolutely. The grass provided a critical layer of insulation against the mechanical violence of the ship.
And speaking of the ship, for a boat that's 190 feet long, the Far West is structurally insane when you really look at it.
Oh, it's a very specific piece of engineering.
Right, because when we hear steamboat,
Mm-hmm.
most of us picture those massive, ornate floating palaces on the lower Mississippi, deep hulls, multiple decks, chandeliers, all that.
The Mark Twain boat.
Exactly.
Right.
That is emphatically not what the Far West was. This boat was built in Pittsburgh in 1870, specifically for the shallow, treacherous waters of the upper Missouri system.
It was essentially a massive steam-powered barge, and the defining feature of the Far West, and Western Rivers steamboats in general, was its draft.
The vertical distance between the waterline and the bottom of the hull.
Right. Unloaded, the Far West drew a mere 20 inches of water.
Wait, 20 inches.
20 inches?
That is less than 2 feet. For a vessel that is nearly 2/3 the length of a football field, having a draft that shallow means it is just skimming the mud.
Yeah.
You could walk beside it in the river and your knees wouldn't get wet.
Yeah.
How do you even keep a craft with that much surface area and that little draft stable in a raging spring current?
That's exactly the structural paradox Marsh 8 was dealing with every day. The hull was entirely flat-bottomed. It had no keel whatsoever.
Go weight down below.
Exactly. All the heavy machinery, the high-pressure boilers, the horizontal steam engines, the massive stacks of cordwood fuel, all of it was sitting directly on the main deck, not down in a hold.
Oh, wow.
This gave the boat an incredibly high center of gravity. It was prone to being blown around by the wind like a kite on the water.
Which sounds terrifying.
It is, but that flat-bottom design was non-negotiable because the upper Missouri and the Yellowstone rivers are not deep, stable channels.
Right. They are braided rivers. They are shallow, totally unpredictable nightmares filled with shifting sandbars. In the late summer, they can dry up into just a series of slack water puddles.
Yeah.
To navigate them, you needed a boat that didn't sail through the water so much as it crawled over the mud.
Crawled over the mud, exactly. And this sets up a profound psychological whiplash for the soldiers boarding the vessel. Think about the sensory environment they had inhabited for the last week.
Pure wilderness warfare. The crack of rifles, the heat of the sun, the smell of dust and sagebrush.
And now, suddenly, they're laid out on a bed of fresh-cut grass on the deck of a high-pressure industrial machine.
Right.
The sensory shift had to be completely alien. Instead of gunpowder, they are smelling hot oil, burning wood, and exhaust steam.
And the noise.
The noise. The Far West was powered by 3 massive boilers. These horizontal engines didn't run smoothly. They utilized high-pressure steam that was exhausted directly into the air through the twin towering smokestacks.
Which means the exhaust didn't hum, it exploded.
Yes. The percussive blast of the escaping steam sounded like cannon fire echoing off the river bluffs.
Oh my God, for a guy with shell shock.
Exactly. Every time the massive paddle wheel bit into the water, the entire wooden superstructure of the boat shuddered and groaned. For men suffering from acute combat trauma, the sheer noise and vibration of this iron beast must have been a new kind of terror.
Just absolutely overwhelming. Oh, and before we leave the loading process, we cannot forget one very specific, very famous passenger who was also brought aboard the Far West.
Ah, yes. Comanche.
Comanche. Captain Miles Keogh's claybank gelding. Comanche was found wandering the battlefield, severely wounded with multiple arrow and bullet strikes.
He was in bad shape.
He is famously recognized as the only U.S. Army horse to survive the immediate Custer engagement. And instead of putting the animal out of its misery, which was standard practice for a severely wounded mount, the soldiers actually led him down to the river, and Marsh brought him aboard.
It speaks volumes about the emotional state of the survivors, I think.
Definitely.
They had lost so much. Their regiment was decimated. Their friends were dead. That horse represented a tangible, living connection to the men they had just buried.
He was a survivor, just like them.
Right. Saving Comanche became this psychological imperative. They even constructed a special stall for him on the deck, right alongside the wounded men.
So just picture the deck of the Far West right now. It is a floating triage ward. Dozens of shattered men resting on river grass, a bloodied cavalry horse in a stall, an exhausted 28-year-old surgeon.
And Captain Marsh.
And Marsh knows he is balancing on a razor's edge. He is critically wounded men who need a proper hospital immediately, and General Terry has just handed him a stack of official dispatches detailing the disaster.
The paperwork that changes everything.
Right. The military is desperate to send a message to the outside world. Marsh isn't just commanding a hospital ship anymore. He is commanding a courier vessel, carrying the darkest news of the decade. The clock is furiously ticking.
But the initial phase of the journey was agonizingly slow. From June 30th to July 2nd, the Far West had to carefully pick its way down the shallow, winding Bighorn River, waiting for Terry and Gibbon's infantry columns to catch up, and then ferrying them across the Yellowstone River.
Just doing regular Army transport stuff.
Right. But by July 3rd, the command was fully across, the dispatches were finalized, and General Terry gave Marsh the green light to make for Fort Lincoln in Dakota Territory.
And the moment Marsh gets that order, the dynamic of the voyage completely changes.
It's like flipping a switch.
The slow, cautious maneuvering ends. The roar of those high-pressure engines kicks up a notch, and Marsh just unleashes the Far West. He commits to a run down the Yellowstone and the Missouri rivers that will cover 710 miles.
And he completes it in an unbelievable 54 hours.
54 hours, averaging over 13 miles an hour, navigating day and night.
That is a speed record that remains unsurpassed in the history of Upper Missouri steamboating. Let that sink in.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me, because I think it's easy to hear 13 miles an hour and think, well, that's not very fast. I can ride a bicycle 13 miles an hour.
Sure, on a paved road.
Right. But we have to understand the environment. Navigating the 1870s Missouri River at full throttle wasn't about steering a clear path. It was about reading Braille on a constantly shifting surface.
That's a great way to put it.
Marsh was navigating an overloaded, top-heavy, highly combustible wooden structure through what was essentially an aquatic minefield.
And we have to factor in the season, too. It is early July. The Yellowstone and Missouri rivers are at their absolute peak flow, swollen with the massive spring snowmelt from the Rocky Mountains.
So the water is just raging.
The rivers are acting like overloaded fire hoses. The sheer volume and velocity of the water are blasting away the outer bends of the riverbanks. And what grows on those riverbanks?
Massive, ancient cottonwood trees.
Precisely. The floodwaters undermine the banks, and these giant trees crash into the river. The heavy, sodden root balls sink and plant themselves firmly in the mud at the bottom of the channel.
Like an anchor.
Exactly like an anchor. The water-stripped trunks are then pushed by the current so they angle downstream, hidden just inches below the muddy surface.
The rivermen called them snags or sawyers. They were the ultimate widowmakers of the western rivers.
Yeah.
If the wooden hull of a steamboat, moving at 13 miles an hour, strikes one of those submerged cottonwood spears, it will punch a hole straight through the bottom of the boat as easily as a needle going through fabric.
And the results are catastrophic.
The river rushes in, the boilers explode when the cold river water hits them, and the boat sinks in minutes. It's the primary reason the average lifespan of a steamboat on the Missouri was just 5 years.
Just 5 years. So when Captain Marsh is running the far west downriver, he isn't just looking at the banks to see where he's going. He has to read the microcurrents on the surface of the water.
Looking for the traps.
Right. He's looking for subtle eddies, boils, or V-shaped ripples that indicate a submerged snag lying in wait. And he has to do this while the boat is rocketing downstream, pushed by a powerful current, meaning his reaction time is cut to absolute fractions of a second.
And he didn't stop when the sun went down.
Hmm.
That is the part that truly terrifies me.
The night navigation.
Yes. Running a steamboat at night on the Missouri was considered almost suicidal under normal conditions. You lose all visual depth perception. You can't read the watercolor.
You're practically blind.
Marsh had to rely purely on the shadows, the sound of the water, and his encyclopedic memory of the river's channel. He had men on the bow constantly throwing a lead line, sounding the depths and calling out the water levels, but
at the speed they were moving, by the time the leadsman called out shallow water, the boat was already over it.
exactly, it's pure instinct.
And this raises an important question about the mechanical toll on the vessel. I mean, to maintain that speed, the engineering crew, the stokers, had to keep the fireboxes absolutely roaring.
How much wood did they burn?
The Far West consumed up to 30 cords of wood a day.
30 cords.
They had to maintain maximum steam pressure in boilers that were notoriously prone to catastrophic failure if the water levels inside them dropped even slightly. It was a masterpiece of seamanship, fueled by sheer adrenaline, extreme skill, and a heavy, heavy dose of luck.
You can imagine the sensory experience for the wounded on the deck during those 54 hours. Just the relentless, rhythmic booming of the exhaust pipes. The tremendous heat radiating up from the boiler deck.
The vibrations alone.
Right, the deck planks trembling so violently that the grass bedding was probably the only thing keeping their fractures from separating. They are watching the river bluffs fly by in a blur, soot and embers raining down from the smokestacks. They are trapped in a machine pushed to its absolute breaking point, praying that Marsh doesn't make a single miscalculation.
But the machinery held together, and Captain Marsh's instincts were flawless. The roar of those engines kept them alive on the river. But as the Far West finally reached the edge of civilization, that mechanical fury was about to give way to something far heavier.
Yeah, the journey shifts from a battle of engineering against nature to an emotional reckoning. It is late at night, 11 p.m. on July 5th.
We've made it to Bismarck.
The Far West finally spots the docks at Bismarck, Dakota Territory. And the approach of the vessel is an incredibly haunting visual. Captain Marsh, honoring naval tradition, had ordered the ship to be draped in black mourning cloth.
Just picture that scene from the perspective of someone standing on the Bismarck docks. It's the dead of night. Emerging from the darkness of the river is this massive, soot-stained steamboat. It is completely swathed in black fabric. There is no brass band, no cheering.
So eerie.
Very. The only sound is the heavy panting of the steam exhaust and the splash of the paddle wheel. The physical journey is ending, but the emotional blast radius is just detonating.
The moment the heavy hemp mooring lines are thrown onto the dock and secured, the crew doesn't wait. They don't casually disembark. They sprint.
You're running into town.
They run into the dirt streets of Bismarck, waking people up, shouting the news that Custer's command has been annihilated. You can imagine the absolute shock ripping through the town.
Total pandemonium.
But the boat doesn't stay long at Bismarck. After dropping the initial bombshell and letting some key personnel off, the Far West drops a few miles further down the river to the military landing at Fort Lincoln.
And this is where the historical timeline becomes almost unbearably tragic. The boat docks at Fort Lincoln in the very early hours of July 6th. The wounded are carefully carried ashore, lifted off their grass beds, and finally placed in the post hospital.
Safe at last.
Dr. Porter, after days of continuous nerve-shattering triage, is finally able to hand his patients over to a fully equipped medical staff. For the wounded, the nightmare of the journey is over. But for the families stationed at the fort, the true nightmare is just beginning.
Because Fort Lincoln was the home base of the 7th Cavalry. This is where the wives, the children, and the families of the soldiers lived. They had waved goodbye to the regiment weeks earlier, expecting the usual victorious return. Now, a blank draped steamboat has arrived in the dark.
In the pre-dawn gloom of July 6th, the officers of the garrison are tasked with the grimmest duty imaginable. Before the rumors from Bismarck can fully penetrate the fort, they have to organize notification details.
Oh, that's rough.
They walk the quiet streets of Officers' Row and the enlisted housing, going from door to door, knocking in the darkness, to notify the families of the dead.
The sources are agonizingly specific here. Depending on the exact ledger, between 24 and 39 women, were made widows overnight in that single garrison.
Yes, looking at the primary documents, the medical history of Fort Lincoln officially reports 24 widows among the enlisted men's wives left at the post.
Okay.
However, Lieutenant Edward Godfrey, an officer of the 7th who survived the hilltop fight, noted in his accounts that there were 39 widows total at the fort. Regardless of the exact number, the concentration of grief is staggering.
And among those widows, of course, was Elizabeth Bacon Custer. Libby Custer. The knock comes to her door, and she learns not just that she has lost her husband, George, but that the battle has effectively erased her entire family structure.
The Custer family was decimated.
She lost her husband, his brothers Tom and Boston Custer, his nephew Audie Reed, and his brother-in-law James Calhoun. 5 members of the Custer family wiped out in a single afternoon.
What's fascinating here, and tragic, is the role Libby Custer takes on. Instead of retreating into her own unimaginable grief, she insists on accompanying the officers as they go down the line to notify the other wives.
He goes with them.
She does. She helps break the news to the women whose husbands served under hers. The fort is just completely engulfed in mourning.
So what does this all mean when we look at the timeline? For me, the profound juxtaposition is inescapable. You have this adrenaline-fueled, record-breaking mechanical triumph of the Far West.
54 hours of fire and steam.
Right, screaming seal and masterful navigation, and it slams abruptly into the quiet, devastating, localized grief of a frontier parlor room. The fastest piece of cutting-edge transportation technology they had was utilized to deliver the darkest possible silence.
It is the ultimate paradox of progress.
Exactly. The technology worked flawlessly, but the payload was pure human tragedy.
But the widows of Fort Lincoln absorbing the end of their personal worlds was only half of the equation. While the fort grieved in isolation, the crew of the Far West, and specifically the men who had sprinted into Bismarck, had a broader duty.
The message.
General Terry's dispatches needed to reach the War Department in Washington, D.C., and the journalists aboard knew they were sitting on the biggest story of the decade. The news had to jump from the frontier to the East Coast.
Which brings us to the Bismarck telegraph office, and the moment the frontier disaster meets the national wire.
Upon docking at Bismarck, Captain R.H. didn't just coordinate the docking procedures, he rushed straight to the Bismarck telegraph office. The operator on duty was a man named J.M. Carnahan. Carnahan took a seat at his key, read the initial dispatches, and tapped out the terse, terrifying message confirming the disaster.
And that single transmission broke the dam.
It truly did. That first message was merely the opening volley of what would become a staggering transmission. Carnahan sat at his post, tirelessly tapping out the details over the duplex telegraph system.
He didn't stop.
He transmitted the official military reports, the lists of the dead, the status of the wounded, and the first-hand journalistic accounts for over 2 straight days. The historical record indicates he sent upward of 50,000 words over the wires.
50,000 words by telegraph key. Think about the physical mechanics of that.
It's mind-boggling.
The telegraph wasn't a keyboard. Carnahan is using Morse code, a complex series of dots and dashes, physically depressing a brass key for every single letter of every single word of a 50,000-word transmission.
Your hand would just seize up.
That is the length of a short novel. Tapped out letter by letter by a single exhausted operator fighting off severe writer's cramp, sending the electrical pulses down the wire to St. Paul, where they were relayed to Chicago, and then pushed east.
And we have to talk about where a massive chunk of those 50,000 words came from. Clement Lounsbury.
Yes, the editor of the Bismarck Tribune.
Lounsbury gets the news, and he immediately marshals his printing press to put together a special extra issue of his paper on July 6th. But for Lounsbury, this is a deeply personal tragedy as well.
Because he was supposed to be there.
He was. Lounsbury was actually supposed to accompany Custer on the expedition as an embedded journalist, but at the last minute, his wife fell ill, so he stayed behind. He sent his top reporter instead.
A man named Mark Kellogg.
Right. And Mark Kellogg rode with Custer's immediate column. He was killed at the Little Bighorn, making him the first Associated Press correspondent to die in the line of duty.
Wow.
Remarkably, some of his notes and his dispatch pouch actually survived the battle, were recovered from the field, and were brought back on the Far West.
So Lounsbury takes the accounts brought back by Captain Marsh, he takes the raw military data, and he takes the surviving notes of his dead friend, Mark Kellogg. He compiles this massive journalistic report, publishes it locally, and feeds it directly to Carnahan at the telegraph office.
Because of the telegraph wires, This news doesn't slowly disseminate via steamboat or stagecoach. It flashes across the country at the speed of electricity.
And if we look at the timing of when this news hits the East Coast, it is almost too theatrical to be believed. You could not write this in a movie script without it feeling overly contrived.
It's incredible timing.
Let's set the national stage here. The telegraph signals hit the major eastern hubs exactly as the United States is deeply entrenched in celebrating its 1876 Centennial exhibition in Philadelphia.
It is July 1876. The nation is celebrating its 100th birthday with a massive exposition of American industrial might, westward expansion, and technological progress.
It's a huge party.
President Ulysses S. Grant and General William T. Sherman are attending the exhibition. The country is marveling at the massive coreless steam engine, the early telephone, and the sprawling network of the telegraph.
It is a nation drunk on its own potency. The prevailing cultural narrative in the East was that the West was essentially won.
Right, the hard part was over.
The transcontinental railroad was finished. The telegraph wires spanned the continent, and the military was a modern, mechanized force. They believed Native American resistance was a fading issue, a mop-up operation for the famed 7th Cavalry.
And right in the middle of this triumphant, self-congratulatory celebration, the telegraph wires hum, the newspaper presses roll, and the nation is brought to a horrified standstill.
The psychological impact on the American public was seismic. It induced a massive wave of cognitive dissonance.
They couldn't compute it.
Right. The public was asking, how could a nation that builds these incredible machines, that has conquered the continent with steel rails and iron wire, lose an entire heavily armed cavalry command to indigenous warriors they had consistently, arrogantly underestimated?
It shattered the illusion of inevitable supremacy.
You have the ultimate symbol of American progress, the telegraph network, delivering the ultimate symbol of frontier vulnerability. The very technological network that had built the boy general myth of Custer over the previous decade, the newspapers, the rapid communication, the dime novels, is the exact same network that delivered the news of his bloody, complete destruction.
And the imagery that hit those Eastern papers was stark, brutal, and sensationalized. The speed of the news meant that initial reports were often chaotic, but the core truth was undeniable.
It was grim.
The New York Times ran the chilling subheadline, "No prisoners taken,"
which was a terrifying fact confirmed by native accounts long after the battle.
Absolutely. For example, the Minneconjou Lakota chief Red Horse surrendered the following year in 1877, and he provided his detailed recollections of the battle through plains, sign language, and ledger drawings.
What did he say about it?
He confirmed the absolute finality of the Custer engagement. The tactical envelope was complete. There were no survivors from that immediate detachment to take prisoner, and no quarter was asked or given. The media absorbed this raw fact and amplified the shockwave, turning a military defeat into a national trauma.
Okay, let's look at the totality of what we've discussed today. We started with shattered, bleeding men being jostled on mule litters in the suffocating dust of the Montana dirt.
The lowest tech misery imaginable.
We moved to the surreal mercy of fresh river grass spread across the vibrating, soot-stained deck of the far west. We rode along for 54 hours of masterful, terrifying navigation down the Missouri River, pushing a steam engine to the brink of explosion.
Captain Marsh at the wheel.
We felt the dead silence of the Bismarck docks, the localized grief of the widows at Fort Lincoln, and finally we listened to J.M. Carnahan's blistering telegraph key pulsing the news right into the celebratory parlors of Philadelphia.
It is a remarkable, unbroken chain of events, and it leaves us with an important synthesis. The journey of the far west downriver isn't just an incredible story of military logistics,
Right.
or a masterclass in riverboat navigation, or even a tragedy of frontier warfare. It represents a fundamental pivot point in American history. It is the exact moment when the raw, unfiltered, bloody violence of the frontier collided head-on with the speed of modern mass media.
Yes, it is the birth of the modern news cycle. Before this, frontier battles were read about weeks or months later. They felt distant.
Almost abstract.
But here, a tragedy occurring in complete geographical isolation is almost instantly transformed into a national obsession, consumed and debated in near real time by a public thousands of miles away.
Exactly. The mechanical speed of the Far West combined with the electrical speed of the telegraph ensured that the Battle of the Little Bighorn wouldn't just be a localized military defeat. It would be seared permanently into the American cultural consciousness.
It changed everything.
And that raises an important question for us today. How much has our relationship with breaking news really changed since J.M. Carnahan sat down at that telegraph key?
Wow, yeah.
We are still a society processing distant trauma at the absolute speed of our technology, struggling to comprehend the reality on the ground through the filter of a wire.
That is a phenomenal, lingering thought to end on.
Yeah.
The speed of trauma and the machinery of media. If artifacts over orthodoxy history is your thing, this is Crazy Horse Chronicles. Subscribe and keep questioning the baseline.
And as a final note, the research for this deep dive was assisted by AI tools to help synthesize the extensive historical sources, medical ledgers, and technical schematics regarding these events. Thank you for listening.